Hi, my name is Reuben. In this series of videos, I'll walk you through the sample Pool Doctors application that I developed for the introduction of Gennaro Mobile. In this particular video, I look at the application start, what happens when the application starts, and in particular the files main.4gl and pool_doctors.4db. So, in terms of the application, it's everything that occurs before we get to this point here. So the initialization and the creation of the database. So if we look under our project, pool_doctors, this first folder, we'll find main.4gl. Now, a 4GL program always starts at the line main and finishes at the line end main. So when you're looking at sources, that's the bit you want to find. Just, if you want to navigate the code beginning to end, find the main statement. So we start off with the main, and the first two lines here are options. They're just some runtime options that instruct the runner as to how to behave at certain stages in the program. So in this instance, because I've got writing a mobile application, I want to use options input no wrap, which is saying whenever I get to the end of a screen, then we're going to assume that you've entered the screen, rather than if we took out the no wrap, then it would loop round inside an input dialog, would go back to the first field in the screen. So we want no wrap, and we want field order form, so that it always goes from top to bottom. The next series of lines here you can see are to do with error handling, and I'll talk about them more in a separate video. But basically, we start writing any errors or exceptions to the file, and then we're saying if any error occurs from this point on, we're going to call this 4GL function. And that means that if anything bad happens, we just display a nice screen to the user rather than a black screen. We have two user interface lines. They don't do much on iOS, but on Android, they display a particular image when your application's running, and in the top left corner, and just give the name to the application. These next series of lines load up some user interface resources, and I'll talk about them more in a separate video. But the action defaults, the styles, just control the appearance and user interface of the application. Finally, we then init the database, so and I'll go through that function very shortly, and then we go off and execute our splash screen. So that screen you saw at this point here, that's our splash screen. So we've got up beyond this point in the code. That's a series of another video, but for this video now, I'm going to explain a bit more in detail what happens inside this init_database function. So the first thing it does is it attempts to connect to a database. If this succeeds, then we know that the database exists, and we can actually carry on at this point. We're happy. If there's a database, it exists, we can carry on connecting to that database, reading from the data, and inserting into it. What if there isn't a database? Well, basically, that scenario is the first time you've ever run the program. So the first time we run the program, we want to create the database. Now, these next 6 or 7 lines, that's just a warning I put in for myself as the developer, because I don't always want to create the database. I don't want to overwrite the database I have. So if I'm not on mobile, I am running in development mode, then I put up a little dialog to say, hey, are you really sure you want to create the database? And if I'm not, then I exit out of the program and stop what I'm doing right away. Note, this only occurs if I'm not running on a mobile. So once we've deployed the app, it will just flow through this code and get on to this next stage. So at this point, we know the database doesn't exist. So what we've got to do, if it's a SQLite database, at the moment, what we can do is create an empty database file. So just using the base.channel classes, open a file and close it, and W argument there for write. So that's going to create a file, pool_doctors.db. And then once we've created that file, we're then going to try and connect to it again. And all going well, then this time we'll be able to connect to that database. And then because it's the first time we're running this against this database, we've got all these lines here, which are going to create the database or create the tables that are in the database. So I'm creating a table called customer with my various column names and the data type. And there's about 7 or 8 tables that are created at this point. Create table, customer, job detail, job header, etc. And once I've finished creating all the tables, then I create some indexes as well. Now, at this point, I could also insert some data if I needed to always insert some data into the tables. But in this particular program, I'm going to rely on the database synchronization process to populate the tables for the first time. The other thing that I should note that I skipped over as I was working through here is once you've connected to the database and you know it exists, in later versions of this application, we're going to test what version we're on and run some scripts to update the database or do things like alter table or add extra columns, etc. So I've got this little placeholder here in the code, which I'll use in later versions. So inside the main 4GL, that's where it's creating the database. Now the other important thing out of all this is how did we know what tables and what columns to create into our database? How did we generate this code here? And for that, we're going to look at the database pool_doctors.4db. So this is my meta schema for my database. It's always a tricky one to show in a video, whether you zoom out and show all the tables, etc. So there's 7 tables sitting in the database. And I'll zoom in again. Basically, we've got our job header table and the 4 various job detail, job note, job photo, job timesheet, and it should also be a customer table and a product table. So this is the schema for our database. And what we can do in here is, just if I right click on there, I can add a table. So give it a table name and also work on the columns. So column name, change the type, etc. And I can add columns. Name 2. Oops. Give it the same name, but here we've created our table, and basically I'll work through that process for all 7 tables that you can see there. Basically just defining the table name, the column name, and the data type. And then I could also at this point within the table, right click, I could add indexes. So that's where I define my indexes. And I could also add a foreign key. So saying I'm adding a foreign key and then drawing the line from one table to another to define the key. So that's something you do right at the beginning of your application, define the database. And then once you've defined that database, I'll just delete what I've just created. Once you've defined that database design, there are 2 things you can do. One is we can generate a schema file, and now that process will occur automatically when you build the application. But what that does is it creates a file that can then be reused by other 4GLs, or a schema of the database, and define database types based on that schema. So you'll notice in most of our sources, there's a line at the top saying schema pool_doctors, and that means that we can define records and database types to be the same as what's inside this database. So we can define a record to have the same structure as this table. So that's one reason why we use these schemas. The second reason we use these schemas is if I select the database, I can go generate a database creation script. If I run that, database schema, SQLite, just normally accept the defaults. What that does is it generates some 4GL code that will actually go through and create the database with these tables. So what I've done with my program is I've run that generation script, and I've copied and pasted the code here from this generated script into my main.4gl. Okay, so when you come along to write your own application, you will hopefully go through a similar process, designing your database out here in the 4DB file and relying on it inside your code for the schema, and you'll also use the generate creation scripts to generate the tables or generate the SQL that you can insert into your programs to generate the database the first time they run. It's an interesting design question, whether you generate the tables the first time the programs run, or whether you copy a 4DB in with your application. The key thing is, if you want to keep the database there each time you upgrade the application, then you're not going to want to copy a 4DB inside your application package. So when we up here and come and create your packages, chances are you don't want to include the database each time you do that. You're going to want to generate the database initially and update it using this 4GL code that gets executed when the program starts. Okay, so that's the introduction to sort of what's inside main.4gl and the database file, the .4db file, and why we use it for the schema and to create a database the first time we run the application.